Hey guys, I'm Angie Designs and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to discuss things that you could do to improve the sewing quality of your sewing-based costumes. Now this is more of a beginner's guide. A lot of more experienced seamstresses, sewists, etc. will be a little bit more familiar with some of these tips. These little things can make such a big difference on your final garment and make you really go from that beginner to more advanced level. And not only does this improve the look of the garment, but all of these things will help improve the durability. So they'll last longer and they won't fall apart with the convention. So tip number one is to avoid using very cheap fabrics. If you use some of the really cheap fabrics, a lot of them kind of just fall apart. I'm talking about like your costume satins and things like that. Just touching them sometimes they fall apart, or you start sewing and then they just fray completely no matter how much fray stop you put on them. So they're hard to use, don't even look that great, and they fall apart. Not exactly the best materials to use. This doesn't mean you need to break the bank to actually make a nice costume for fabrics. There's a lot of ways to get thriftier fabrics. As long as you're avoiding the costume fabrics, you're probably good to go. Tip number two, wash your fabrics before you sew with them. Now this can be a bit of a pain sometimes, but a lot of fabric does shrink, or they have a finish on them that needs to be washed out, or whatever else the reason might be. Washing your fabrics will improve the quality. The worst thing ever is when you finish sewing something and you wash it for the first time and it comes out of the machine far smaller than it was before. Always wash your fabric beforehand. Tip number three, always use your iron and press before, during, and after sewing. What I mean by this is press your fabric after it's been washed so it's not all wrinkling everything. So you're cutting everything the way the pattern that either you made or that you purchased is intended to be, because if it's wrinkly, you're gonna end up with a little bit of extra space in there just from the wrinkles causing folds and creases. When you're sewing, after every seam, you should by rights press it flat. A pressed seam versus an unpressed seam have such a very different look to them. Unpressed seam can look bubbly, can look puckery, can look like all these undesirable looks, while a pressed seam looks really nice and really clean and very satisfying. You don't need fancy things or things like a pressing hand here to do the job. You can do so with just an ironing board and an inexpensive iron like this one from Walmart. And not only does it make a garment look better, it actually does help with the integrity of your stitches as well. Pressing that heat into the stitch into the seam actually makes the fibers kind of enclose around the stitches a little bit better, and therefore makes it much stronger. It just kind of sets the seam and sets those stitches into place in that seam. So it looks better, it's satisfying looking, it's the proper method for stitching, and it also actually helps the integrity of the garment as well. So it makes your costume more durable. Tip number four, always finish your seams in some manner. Now finishing a seam refers to when you do something to the seam or the seam allowance to keep it from fraying. If you're newer to sewing, you'll find out that fabric does this a lot. And over time, fabric can kind of just come apart a little bit, and the more you wear it, the more it rubs up against you as you're wearing it, or whatever else other layers you're wearing. It'll come over to your stitches eventually and just fall apart. And obviously, if we're trying to make durable costumes, that isn't the best thing to happen. So finishing the seam is a way of enclosing your seam and finishing it and keeping it from getting to that fraying. It can be as simple as using a serger to finish those edges with a clean wrapped edge. You can use bias tape to bind the edges, bind them together, or you can bind them flat separately. You can make a French seam, you can make a welt seam. There's a whole bunch of different ways, and it's something I might cover eventually in a video. But you shouldn't ever have an unfinished seam. Tip number five. As tempted as you might be because you're trying to save time or you're crunching for that con, do not use the long stitches on your machine. It might seem like that will make it go faster, but certain fabrics really do require smaller stitches, and the longer stitches are a lot easier to come undone. One little hang fingernail and suddenly you have the entire seam coming apart on your sleeve. The standard size on your sewing machine is usually the ideal size. Anything bigger than that, you're getting into an area that's only for gather or basting stitches. And those stitches are meant to come out. So that seam won't be very strong once you're finished stitching with it. And same with top stitching, it will end up just kind of eventually coming out and coming loose. So you have to be careful with your stitch length and don't come into the temptation of just using the long one because it goes through the machine faster. It might, but is it really worth it if you have to redo the seam later anyways? And tip number six, when using a new fabric, and this can be something that's completely brand new to you or just a new swatch of fabric, test it out with a tiny piece or a tiny swatch beforehand. Different fabrics react to different stitch lengths very differently. Your standard stitch on your sewing machine probably won't work for every single fabric. Finer fabrics will require a smaller stitch, for example. So go through and try out the different tensions on your machine and the different stitch lengths on any new fabric that you're using to see which one looks the best. You don't want your fabric ending up wrinkling or really tense stitches. You want it to lay nice and flat and clean. And then when you actually go to sew your final garment, you won't have weird puckering and weird things happening and have to figure out then when you've already started sewing and suddenly it's all overwhelming. No, you won't have that because you've already tested it out on a swatch piece of fabric, a small little piece that you cut out beforehand to run through the machine to see what kind of stitch length to use. This will save you so much time, and it's so quick to just put a piece of fabric, tiny little piece of fabric, through a machine just to see how it reacts to different stitch lengths and tensions. So this has been 6 basic tips that you can use to help improve your sewing. They're all simpler things to do, but that can really make a really big difference on your final costumes. To more advanced cosplayers, these might seem like basic, like, oh, of course, these are no-brainers. Of course you do these things. But beginners, these aren't always things that you think of off the top of your head when you think of starting to sew a new project. So I hope this has been helpful to those of you who are new to sewing, and maybe it has a fun little reminder to those of you who are a little bit more advanced in your sewing. Thank you guys so much for watching, and be sure to like, subscribe, and all that good stuff. Check out my Instagram and Ko-fi and all that kind of stuff as well, and I'll see you in the next video. See you guys later!